All right, let me start presenting. All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Community Vulnerability Scoping Meeting. Today, we will explore what community vulnerability means for wildfire mitigation planning, identify practical applications for taking community vulnerability into account, identify future topics to consider, and discuss how best to learn from one another. My name is Emily Ginsberg. I'm a wildfire safety analyst with the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. I'll be your host and moderator. To begin the morning, we'll first hear opening remarks from our director, Caroline Thomas Jacobs, and from the Natural Resources Agency's Deputy Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice, Nowaki Schwartz. Director, you have the floor.
Thank you, Emily, and good morning, everyone. First, I'd really like to thank the staff and management of the Electric Safety Policy Division, specifically Emily Ginsberg, Sarah Moore, Sarah Havorka, Nicole Dunlop, and Lucy Morgans, who have researched, organized, and prepared all of the materials for this workshop. Thank you for the time and thoughtfulness you've put into developing the agenda, finding the panelists, and managing the logistics. I know these workshops take a great deal of effort, and I appreciate all that you have put into it to make it a success. I have been looking forward to this workshop with great anticipation because it is addressing a need that has been for too long not recognized. The consequences of disaster are not experienced equally, and we must ensure that any and all risk assessments performed by utilities to address utility-related wildfire safety do not continue or exacerbate this injustice. As I am sure Deputy Secretary Schwartz will discuss in more detail, the Newsom administration has made a priority of embedding equity in the work of the state. And I can't think of a more important place to ensure that we are considering equity in this work than considering it in utility wildfire risk modeling. The models literally are the first step in identifying where and when investments are made to reduce wildfire risk. The wildfire mitigation plans submitted to our office this year by PG&E, Edison, and San Diego, and now more recently from the other 5 utilities, total more than $28 billion in planned investments over the next 3 years. It's critical that we ensure that those investments are informed and made in an equitable manner, that those investments mitigate the highest risk, and that our understanding of that risk is inclusive of the significant burdens for recovery experienced by socially vulnerable populations, such as those who are low income, have access and functional needs, and or who have been structurally marginalized through systemic racism. Today's discussion is an important step forward in that effort, and I welcome our panelists, Ms. Kovich, Dr. Mendez, and Ms. Reynolds, and I look forward to the presentations and the conversation today. Thank you. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand it over to the Deputy Secretary.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and I really am so grateful to be invited to speak today about something that I am really passionate about and is frankly just has turned into my life's work. And I'm here to talk to you about one of the most pressing issues of our time: equity and environmental justice. And as you know, California is facing unprecedented challenges, including wildfires. And these challenges affect all of us, but especially low-income communities and communities of color, Indigenous people, and other marginalized groups who have historically borne the brunt of environmental injustice. Historically, corporations and government have played a significant role in systemic racism. And in my mind, we're also really responsible for helping to unwind it. The Newsom administration has made equity a central tenet, issuing an equity executive order in 2022, which really directed state agencies and departments across California to take additional actions to embed equity analyses and considerations in their mission, policies, and practices. It was really sweeping. And the Resources Secretary has also made equity a priority, pushing all of our natural resource agency departments to, in his words, really operationalize that equity. And that's really what my role is all about, which is a new role. It's about really embedding these principles of environmental justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into the work of our agency and its 26 member departments. And our agency oversees some of the most precious and vital resources in our state: our water, land, wildlife, parks, forests, energy, minerals, and our coast and ocean. And how we manage these resources affects not only our environment and economy, but also our own health and well-being. Unfortunately, we know that not all Californians have equal access to these benefits or even bear equal burdens from the harms. For far too long, underserved communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by pollution, environmental degradation, underinvestment, and discrimination. And these communities have also been historically excluded from the decision-making processes that affect their lives. I just really want to underscore that last statement. So the very communities that have had to endure the biggest pollution burdens and have had the fewest resources to actually recover from catastrophic events like wildfires have not gotten a say in the decision-making. And this, in my mind, is really unjust and frankly, just not sustainable. I heard someone once say that we cannot protect our natural resources without protecting the people who depend on them. And we cannot address the climate crisis without addressing the social crisis. And when it comes to wildfires, I really believe that we can't consider the community impacts without really ensuring that we're considering and including the voices of our most vulnerable. So today's scoping meeting is a key opportunity to really listen and learn from one another about how best to integrate community vulnerability within utility wildfire mitigation planning. And it's also really a chance for all of us to problem solve together and to really think about equity and planning now. And I really urge every single person here to really continue to thinking about and participating in this issue as we move forward. We really can't achieve our vision of a healthy and prosperous California for all without ensuring that that really does mean every single one of us. I'm so grateful that you all are here today, and thank you so much for participating in this really critical work.
Thank you. And thank you both. We appreciate you being here to help us get started and thinking about these important issues. Here is our meeting agenda, and we'll all do our best to stay on track with the time. We'll start today with a panel to discuss why community vulnerability matters in wildfire mitigation planning. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. We'll also hear presentations by Energy Safety and by Southern California Edison. And we have 2 roundtable discussions to explore these matters further. We'll aim to close out and discuss next steps by 12:30 today. Some logistics. If you have a question or if you'd like to contribute to the discussion later on during the roundtables, please use the raise hand button on Zoom. Participants will be unmuted in order of hands raised. For anyone calling in, you'll need to press 2 to raise your hand. You can also use Zoom's Q&A feature to write a question, and questions will be read by the moderator. All right, we have a great panel bringing together nonprofit, government, and academic perspectives today. I'll now hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Brittany Kovich.
Good morning. Thank you, Emily. Brittany Kovich. I'm the Policy and Outreach Division Chief with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy.
Yeah. And Kaylee Reynolds.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. My name is Kaylee Reynolds. I work for Sierra Business Council, and I'm a project manager and program manager of the Sierra Climate Adaptation and Mitigation Partnership.
Thank you, Kaylee. And Dr. Michael Mendez. Do we have Dr. Mendez on the line with us today?
Emily, I think his Zoom is playing up.
Yes, it appears that Dr. Mendez is not on the line.
Oh, okay.
Maybe if we start with the first two panelists and then move on to Dr. Mendez.
That sounds good. We'll come back to him. All right. Brittany, would you like to go ahead and share your presentation?
Certainly. Give me just a moment. All right, can everybody see my screen? Great. All right, thank you. As I mentioned, Brittany Kovich, I'm the Policy and Outreach Division Chief with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. Really excited to be here today and just grateful for the opportunity to talk with everyone about what we at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy think about when we think about community vulnerability to wildfire and why we care, really. For those of you who are not familiar with us, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy is a state conservancy under the California Natural Resources Agency, and we're focused heavily on landscape and community resilience. This photo of Downeyville, California, gives you a really good visual idea of what the landscapes and the communities in our service area look like. And just a little bit more background. So the Sierra Nevada Conservancy service area covers just about a quarter of the state of California. And even though our population sits just under 1 million people, the region is one that is of critical importance to the whole state. Most of California's drinking water comes from the Sierra Cascade region, and some of the utilities likely represented here today manage many of those upper watersheds. We have rich biodiversity. Our forests store incredible amounts of carbon, helping us mitigate climate change. And our region also hosts tens of millions of people who come to enjoy places like Desolation Wilderness, the Pacific Crest Trail, Yosemite every year. And wildfire is hands down our #1 issue. 44% of the state's elevated or extreme fire risk falls within the 24 county area that we serve. 8 of the state's 20 largest fires have burned in our service area. 7 of the most destructive, and 3 of the deadliest, including the deadliest on record, the 2018 Camp Fire. All of those have occurred within our region, actually since the Conservancy was created in 2004. So we know that Sierra Cascade region is going to have fire. Fire's not going away. Our region is filled with fire adapted forests, and fire plays a really key role in maintaining their function. In fact, when we think about landscape and community resilience at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, we think about how we at the state can help our communities and our landscapes prepare for an increase in the frequency of fire, because we know that's coming. We'll see warming temperatures and more extreme shifts in precipitation, which I think Kaylee will talk about. And there's an emerging acceptance that fire is such an essential process in the Sierra Cascade region. One of our key tools that we have in our toolbox to avoid more deadly and destructive fires is good fire. Getting more prescribed fire managed for natural resource benefit, and cultural burning on the landscape is key for us. So I think the bottom line here really is that in many parts of California, and especially in the Sierra Cascade region, there's going to be more fire. So how do we deploy the various measures that each of us have at our fingertips to avoid the worst outcomes of those fires? As I said earlier, we've got fire risk across the Sierra Cascade region. It is forested. We have trees and brush and grass and people and all of the factors that are needed for a place to catch fire. So the risk is there, but what we care more about is the consequence of those places catching fire. And consequences are what we're at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy thinking about when we think about community vulnerability. If it burns, what will happen? There are demographic and socioeconomic vulnerabilities to consider, like who lives there? Can they afford to do defensible space and home hardening? Are they physically able? There's housing and transportation vulnerabilities to consider. Do people have the means to evacuate should they be told to? Is there reliable internet or cell service? Do people have connectivity to emergency and evacuation warnings? What are the structures like? How many of them are likely to be up to code? Part of the Sierra Cascade region's charm is the historic gold mining and railroad era neighborhoods. So think of Nevada City, think of Truckee, think of Placerville, think of Greenville. All of those communities predate building codes and fire forensics. Are our structures insured, or even are they fully insured? Skyrocketing home prices in recent years have caused many homes to be underinsured. What are the roads like? Are they maintained by somebody? Are they dirt? Can suppression vehicles get in and can people get out? And how much of a safety net do the residents have if their home burns? Where will they go? How far away do they have to go during an evacuation? Do they have the resources to get back on their feet? And then are there community capacity or other community resources to consider? How stable are the community's organizations and local government capacity? In our experience, high capacity communities often have organization and finances to protect their own structures and people, where vulnerable communities often lack the resources to effectively protect their own structures or people from wildfire. So there can be more consequence from a wildfire. Low capacity communities often also lack the resources to recover from wildfire, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So many of these factors I think will sound familiar to those of you who have included an assessment of community vulnerability in your wildfire mitigation plans, but let me show you a few examples about why these are so important in the Sierra Cascade region. Destructive wildfires have impacted a number of the rural communities in the Sierra Cascade region. This map here shows a handful of the communities that have been impacted from that top 20 most destructive wildfires list that I showed you earlier. You'll probably recognize names like Paradise, Greenville, Greasley Flats from the Camp, Dixie, and Caldor fires. But there are dozens of communities just like these across the Sierra Cascade region that would suffer the same consequences should they experience a wildfire. Research has shown that the impacts of the Camp Fire in Paradise were unequal. And I think there's lessons learned here about what makes populations vulnerable that could be considered when determining where to reduce risk first. In the Camp Fire, newer homes that were built to stricter codes were less likely to burn. People who died were more likely to be elderly or disabled. I think Camp Fire recovery also provides some lessons learned. Some residents had to move back before potable water was restored because insurance funding or additional living expenses had run out and they did not have the means to go elsewhere. People who wished to relocate after the fire were unable to sell their homes in a town without potable water. So this impacted even people that wished to leave the area once the fire had burned. And there were also residents who couldn't afford to test the water as frequently as was recommended. The North Complex burned through the community of Berry Creek and destroyed the town's only store. It had been owned and operated by a family that had immigrated there from Syria 15 years earlier. And there are so many towns across the Sierra Cascade region where there is only one store. And loss of that one store, or the post office, or the gas station, or the health clinic, if they're lucky enough to have it, can mean driving for hours just to get your groceries or your mail or your medicine. So imagine what that means for someone who has limited mobility or limited income to suddenly have to drive 2 or 3 or more hours just to get the things that they need to survive. In addition to the historic community of Greenville, the Dixie Fire destroyed the Greenville Rancheria's medical and dental facilities, the tribal office, and the environmental and fire office, as well as 2 of their fire trucks and other vehicles. These are essential services for any community, but are even harder to come by in rural areas and for tribes. This clip from a story on Greenville and the Dixie Fire hints at the challenges that many of our rural communities face. In our region, we've seen that there's a really high dependence on local community foundations or community-based organizations and local philanthropy to help raise or donate funds, both for fire prevention and also for fire recovery. And when communities lack these resources to develop and implement complex projects, it can make the road to resilience and recovery even more difficult. I actually just read an article this morning about the Mariposa Community Foundation seeking donations for residents impacted by the 2022 Oak Fire. The donations cover basic essentials like electricity for people's wells or temporary shelter for people and physical placement of water tanks. And the article indicated that the foundation had already helped, I think, 78 families, but that more were still in need of these essential services. This kind of community infrastructure is really key to recovery, and not all communities have this kind of support. So to wrap it up, I think community vulnerability isn't an easy thing to assess or measure, but it's really important. We could spread our fire risk reduction measures out across the state and some good would be done. We don't want to downplay any investment in wildfire mitigation. Every single investment is needed and valued, but there's a lot of utility maintenance and a lot of upgrades to be done across our state. And there has to be some framework for prioritizing these tasks. And we want to be smart about where we put our limited resources. So looking at community vulnerability or the consequence of a wildfire on a community is one way that we can do that. And it's really important if we want to sustain places like this. As the Deputy Secretary said when we started, if we want to protect our natural resources, we have to protect the people that help manage them. I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Brittany, thank you so much for your talk. You brought up a lot of really important considerations, and also appreciate you bringing the spotlight on those very real people and communities. And just a reminder to us all to keep them in mind as we talk today. I'll hand the floor now to Kaylee Reynolds for her discussion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that is up. Great. So I'm Kaylee Reynolds from Sierra Business Council and happy to follow Brittany. I think my talk will segue great after hers. So I'm going to show the process that we use to identify and measure vulnerable communities in the Sierra Nevada Climate Vulnerability Assessment. This was published last fall and was funded by Sierra Nevada Conservancy. So another way to show how much they care about these communities. So to start us off in a broad sense, climate risk is the result of a climate hazard occurring within a vulnerable community or landscape. So we started by using climate projection data to understand the likelihood of these climate hazards occurring. So to set the stage, here are some examples of what is expected by the mid-century. So that's 2035 to 2064. So these two examples are from Plumas County, where the Dixie Fire occurred and Brittany touched on, and also Nevada County. These two counties are fairly representative of the Sierra region as a whole, somewhat excluding the high elevation of Sierra Crest in the Eastern Sierra. So across the region, using these two as models here, the projections show the number of hot days and warm nights increasing 6-fold, the number of acres burned in wildfire increasing by 50%, mostly more across all the counties in the region, and the snow water equivalent in the spring, so that's a measure of how much water is stored in the winter snowpack, decreasing by more than 50%. So the SWE, the snow water equivalent indicator, is a little odd. It doesn't really account for drought, but it does show us that changing precipitation patterns in the Sierra are likely going to show up as more precipitation falling as rain than as snow. So these indicators and their projections are all interconnected, and they really do show increasing wildfire hazard through all these different ways. So warmer temperatures lead to drier vegetation, really hard firefighting conditions, more acres burned, we have higher risk in general, more ecosystems, more people at risk. And having less snowpack in the Sierra means drier landscapes, water shortages, and water storage issues. We're kind of even seeing with a big winter, these water storage issues that California has as a whole. And then also, if we are going to see more precipitation falling as rain than snow, we can expect to see more mudslides, especially in burn scars. So we really get this full circle of how these are all connected. So once we knew what the hazards were and what was likely to happen, we then looked at 3 things to begin identifying vulnerable communities in our region. So first, we looked at the disadvantaged groups that live in the region. This was touched on earlier in the introduction. So people living in poverty, people of color, tribal communities, historically disinvested communities. Second, we need to think about who in the region is likely to have high exposure to a hazard like wildfire. And a lot of these populations overlap with disadvantaged communities. But in our region, we did have some surprises, so people who live on single access roads, these people likely own large properties, may be financially well off, but have really high exposure. People without broadband or cell service at their homes, and in our region, even tourists, people that have less local knowledge and don't know how to deal with hazards when they occur. And finally, we have to look at who has low to no capacity to adapt to hazards. When we talk about vulnerable communities, we tend to think about, the governments that have capacity to adapt, but it's also important to think about who personally can adapt. So this would look like, who can or can't install air conditioning or air filtration systems as we have rising temperatures and air quality issues from more wildfires. So once we identified these populations that kind of fall into those 3 categories, we then needed to understand these populations. So we have to get the data, determine exposure, and evaluate capacity. So this example here is families in poverty in the Sierra Nevada region. And this group will be most exposed to extreme heat, smoke and ash, and wildfire due to their quality or lack of housing, the jobs they're likely to work outdoor, they can't miss work, and more limited access to public resources and services. And then thinking about their capacity to adapt. So people on fixed incomes, can't necessarily afford to evacuate. They can't afford air conditioning or air filtration systems. And then also, what's the likelihood that they've been involved in community planning or have been signed up for early warning notification systems? So once we understand who the population is, we need to know the risk that they will face in a hazard and how likely they are to recover from a hazard. So during a wildfire, families in poverty are less likely to evacuate due to a lack of transportation, an inability to miss work, and not having a place to relocate to. So this means they're going to have more exposure to air quality issues and potentially fatal outcomes like Brittany touched on. If they do evacuate, they may experience more economic hardship. They're going to miss work and there's going to be unexpected costs associated with evacuation. After the hazard, in the case of property damage or even long evacuation times, folks are less likely to have insurance or the capital to cover expenses and losses. So this can look like an outmigration of people impacted by these hazards, increased homelessness, or increased deep poverty in a community. All of these outcomes reduce the capacity of the community to prepare and recover from the next hazard. So after we did this type of analysis for all of our identified vulnerable populations, we then scored the vulnerability of each group compared to the hazard. We did this using the Adaptation Planning Guide vulnerability rubric, which does compare potential impact and adaptive capacity. Personally, I'm not a big fan of scoring or ranking vulnerable communities, but it can help us identify the greatest hazards and prioritize next steps. So as you can see in the heat map, we did identify wildfire as the greatest threat to all the vulnerable communities in the Sierra. And a big reason for identifying wildfire is the potential impact between the climate data projections, historically mismanaged forest, extensive drought, utility malfunctions. We know we can expect more record-breaking fires in the region. So we ended up identifying people without broadband, the housing burdened, people of color, and residents 65 and older as being the highest priority to protect from climate hazards. So I'll give a little explanation of why each of these were chosen. So a majority of residents do not have access to broadband in the Sierra region. This means they have less access to community planning, and in the event of a wildfire happening, they're going to be harder to reach and cause delays in evacuation and emergency response. Housing burdened populations have less disposable income to endure and recover from climate hazards and less able to personally adapt to hazards. A quarter of the population identifies as a race or ethnicity other than white alone. So this lack of diversity can lead to segregated communities where populations of color have fewer lines of communication or planning opportunities, and this leads to less emergency preparedness and fewer dedicated resources to a vulnerable population. About a quarter of the region's population is 65 years or older, and seniors are vulnerable due to their reliance on medical care and their increased need for assistance during evacuations and power outages. And many seniors in this area are on fixed incomes and are not financially able to personally adapt. So it's also important to think about the secondary impacts of wildfire on vulnerable communities. Looking closely at this graphic, you can see the purple dotted arrow, the wildfire arrow, leads to all of these impacts in the gray boxes. And these impacts all have extreme consequences for vulnerable communities. One that I just want to point out is power outages. Planned power outages have been identified as a wildfire mitigation method. And while it's absolutely true, a power line or transformer that's not active has a very low likelihood of sparking a mega fire. But the impacts from this method can lead to public health and economic impacts, which disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. And lastly, to end my presentation, I think doing this type of vulnerable population work strongly benefits from a regional approach. So using the same type of methods we use to identify vulnerable populations can be used to identify vulnerable regions. So really looking at landscapes and fire hazard risk in areas like the map that Brittany showed, and then doing regional, sub-regional approaches to identify the specific populations that live in these different high-risk regions. And that's going to help us develop mitigation strategies that will specifically benefit those specific populations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaylee. I think it's really helpful to hear your thinking and your approach as you were going through this vulnerability assessment and sharing with the group. I think that's going to really inform our discussion today. All right, I see we have Dr. Michael Mendez. I'll go ahead and yield the floor to you to introduce yourself and start your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Again, I'm Mike Mendez. I'm an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning and Andrew Carnegie Fellow at the University of California, Irvine. This is a great panel to be here and to be the last to present because my two colleagues provided some excellent background on assessing social vulnerability and identifying those populations most at need. So we're going to go from the big picture, sort of abstract notions of impacts and data gathering to a little bit more in-depth analysis of the invisible and hidden populations that are often most stigmatized and most impacted by extreme wildfire events, such as undocumented Latino, Indigenous migrants, farm workers, and other migrant communities. Identifying these invisible hidden populations is important because in California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. As it has been mentioned before, in the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, wildfires in California do not happen in isolation. They often now compound with other hazards, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health, which describes this multiple linked illnesses occurring all at once with the intersection with other hazards to exacerbate existing inequality and illness. So now more than ever, it's crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of extreme wildfire impacts to undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Given their social status, undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants are particularly vulnerable to disasters such as wildfires and require special consideration in disaster planning. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English and Spanish proficiency, and fear deportation in their everyday lives, or what I often call their pre-disaster marginalized status. So in essence, disasters can create this hyper form of marginalization for undocumented migrants. And if we really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants, including them in our social safety net, unemployment insurance, disaster aid at the federal and local government, healthcare, and really ensure that they have the resources to prepare for a disaster and to recover and be more resilient after a disaster. This research that I have done is really community-based and focused. I've written this research based in the Central and North Coast, Santa Barbara, Ventura, and Sonoma counties that shows how undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy in disaster aid because of cultural norms and cultural and racial norms of U.S. citizenship and who is considered a worthy disaster victim. I presented this along with migrant rights organizations that have been at the forefront of these disasters, both in the North and Central Coast, and we provided policy briefings to multiple media and policymakers at the local, state, national, and even international levels, including NOAA, the United Nations Migration Agency, and several state agencies, and of course, local disaster organizations. And what we really want to hone in is that political choices are being made that prioritize some lives over others. And these disparate impacts to undocumented migrants, farm worker communities are not by accident or happened in coincidence, but it's because of intentional political choices that policymakers and disaster mutual aid organizers have decided to withhold some of these resources from these communities. As it was mentioned before, climate change is making wildfire season more longer and more severe. Moreover, 17 of the 20 largest wildfires by acreage in California have occurred since the year 2000. And Sonoma County, one of my research sites, it's an epicenter of wildfires and the bastion of California's high-end wine industry, and it has suffered from multiple years of extreme wildfire events that have been ranked in the top 5 and top 20 for the most destructive and deadly wildfires in California's history. Cumulatively, they have burned nearly 1 million acres, destroyed over 12,000 structures, and caused 34 deaths. While climate scientists expect wildfires to become more frequent and severe, it's important to explore how some people and communities are more affected by these events than others. In California, while many of the fire-prone regions are largely populated by higher income groups, they also include hundreds of thousands of low-income individuals who lack the resources to prepare or recover from fire. These numbers will likely surge according to the California 4th Climate Assessment Report, which projects the state's wildfire burn area may increase by 77% by the end of the century. The state of California currently does not have a comprehensive analysis of wildfire based on social vulnerability indices, immigration status, or other demographic data. I understand that the state is undergoing that process, so I applaud those efforts. And I also applaud the efforts of the Sierra Business Council for their climate vulnerability assessment. And so both at the state level and as these NGOs create these vulnerability indices, it's important that they're also ground truthed and work ground truth with community-based organizations, migrant serving organizations, tribal organizations as well, to really ensure that the information is accurate and represent some of these hidden invisible populations. Such outcomes occurring during and after wildfires have major environmental justice implications in that certain populations, due to their socioeconomic status, must live with the disproportionate share of environmental impacts and suffer the related public health and quality of life burdens. Moreover, in our research, we investigate how human identities such as gender, class, race, indigeneity, and immigration status intersect with wildfire disaster to compound or intensify some of these individuals for specific individuals. Sonoma County, as I mentioned before, has been the epicenter of extreme wildfire and environmental justice in the state. Media outlets, governments, and scholars across the country, however, have largely focused on reports on the loss of coastal and hillside mansions and impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers. The Sonoma fires, however, not only destroyed expensive property and crops, but it also endangered the health and livelihood of thousands of undocumented migrants. California is home to an estimated 2.5 million undocumented migrants, many of whom are farm workers or employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Sonoma County, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for 8% of the population, or 38,000 people, and this is likely an underestimate. Uh, Governments in California, in particular, often overlook the needs of indigenous farm workers and migrant families in developing disaster plans. Sonoma County is home to a growing indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that over 12,000 indigenous people from southern Mexico live and work in Sonoma County. Again, this is likely an underestimate. They are often concentrated in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops and wine grapes. Indigenous migrants perform an increasing amount of the arduous labor, which contributes to the profitability and affordability of fresh fruits, vegetables, and wine. In particular, indigenous Mexican people in Sonoma County are often culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate, and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native languages such as Mixteco, Triqui, Maya, and Chatino. And it's important to note here that indigenous Mexican people are not Hispanic or Latino, but indigenous. They are often homogenized with Latino communities and really not addressed in terms of language justice. Sometimes there's even confusion about indigenous Mexican languages or Central American indigenous languages, that they may be similar to the Spanish language, but they're entirely different. While disaster relief efforts in Sonoma fires and throughout the state have largely been praised as effective, migrant workers were especially impacted from the fire due to the loss of employment, violations of occupational health and safety standards, the lack of evacuation information in their native languages, confusion about eligibility for disaster relief services, and poor infrastructure and housing in migrant communities. Undocumented migrants' socioeconomic situation is usually precarious. However, the wildfire disaster intensified the already difficult situation. The Sonoma fires, moreover, revealed how undocumented migrants and those with seasonal work visas require special consideration in disaster planning. These individuals are often afraid to seek help and restitution during and after a wildfire for fear of deportation. Undocumented migrants are also unable to access disaster relief services because of language barriers and an explicit prohibition at the federal level from assessing disaster assistance programs. For example, the lack of occupational health and safety standards is of key concern as intensifying wildfires collide with harvest season each year. Undocumented farm workers are shouldering the burden of protecting Sonoma's wine grapes from smoke and ash. Fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, from wildfire smoke, which is this toxic mix of heavy metals and other chemicals from burning structures and other objects, can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than PM 2.5 from other sources such as car exhaust. Since 2015 in Northern California, the annual mean PM 2.5 has increased as a result of extreme wildfire events, and these events have taken over as a main source of PM 2.5 exceedances. The harm that wildfire smoke causes to farm workers may be greater than previously thought, bolstering the argument for additional research and policies to help safeguard some of the most vulnerable and stigmatized population, particularly when farm workers are asked to enter into mandatory evacuation zones that are considered hazardous to the general population, so they can enter these evacuation zones to harvest wine grapes and other precious crops. And before I conclude, I want to read these two key quotes from our research that we interviewed individuals that talks about some of these issues. For example, this individual here tells us, we all got sick from breathing too much smoke and ash, and our kids couldn't go to school. And we had to seek masks and medicaments for our throats and some goggles because my eyes were irritated when I worked. This was from an indigenous farm worker. And other farm workers also told us that they were working hours and days, and sometimes even weeks in these toxic smoky conditions, and would come home and literally have black saliva. Another landscaper told us, I could not get to the homes where I worked because the streets were closed. Two of the homes I worked at were destroyed. One of my good friends was lost during the disaster. He had only been living in an area for 3 weeks before he died. I myself am a cancer survivor and the only one who provides for the family. So this quote here really exemplifies how these farm workers and other migrant workers have existing health disparities, and that extreme wildfire events only exacerbates those social inequalities and health disparities, again, creating a syndemic from the field of public health. So in closing, I really want to leave with this research implication that we must think beyond just property values and understand that these wildfire impacts happen beyond just the actual footprint of the fire. It has cascading effects to farm workers, to the tourist industry, housekeepers, and landscapers. And these communities, while their homes may not have themselves been burned down because because they're unable to access unemployment and other disaster aid, they may be more affected by wildfire disasters than a homeowner that has access to disaster aid and homeowner insurance. And then finally, I think we all become desensitized to these pictures of young children wearing N95 masks. But if you look at the date of this photo, it's in 2017. So it really shows how this population, including young children, have been living with the disparate and disproportionate impacts of climate-induced disasters like wildfires. And then finally, we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A. It's really understanding how wildfires destroying some of our critical infrastructure and exacerbating the digital divide that we already know disproportionately impacts low-income people of color. We've seen how extreme weather events, climate-induced disasters from Puerto Rico to Texas has cut off people from emergency information, and also really acknowledging that a lot of the shelter and evacuation orders, and even making FEMA and local disaster assistance applications are mostly all done on online apps and applications. So it's important to ensure that we have infrastructure, particularly our broadband and cellular, that can withstand extreme wildfire events and other extreme weather events as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'm happy to talk to you more about some of the policy recommendations that this community-based research has put forward around extreme wildfire events and other compounding disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez. I really appreciate your talk and bringing up the importance of understanding the population and also being inclusive when we're thinking about community and vulnerability. We now have a question and answer session with our panelists. A reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please press the raise hand button on Zoom. Participants will be unmuted in order of hands raised. For anyone calling in on the phone, you'll just need to press 2 to raise your hand. And we do have the Zoom Q&A feature as well. When it is your turn, please briefly state your name and affiliation.
Emily, we have a couple of Q&As that have just come through.
Oh, wonderful. All right, I'll read the first question. In a wildfire, human lives are lost, regardless of socioeconomic conditions. Value of a human life is equal anywhere. Preventing loss of lives should be of utmost importance in evaluating consequence. In assessing overall risk density of population, lack of ingress-egress risks in high fire risk regions should carry more weight than risk factors targeting certain groups of population. I think that's a really important comment to make, and definitely something that we'll be thinking about during the roundtables and now. Do any of our panelists have anything to add on to that?
Sure. I think that's an important question that somebody is coming into this space of social vulnerability, environmental justice, and equity should explore. And that's the very purpose of this webinar, is to understand that we have a human-centered approach to our climate, environmental, and wildfire planning, and that we respect the value of all communities and lives. But even within that, it's been very well documented that while disasters or climate-induced disaster does not discriminate, some people are more protected than others because of the historic injustices of how we have planned our communities, in particular around infrastructure. Historically, low-income communities of color, particularly African American and Native American communities, have been withheld some of the key infrastructure, those ingress and egress type of safety urban planning and transportation planning initiatives, let alone other types of resources that could make these communities more resilient to wildfire disasters. So really understanding that not all communities have those vital resources to make them more protected and safeguarded. So that's what we're trying to really emphasize here is having that really strong equity and environmental justice lens as we do the planning.
Thank you. We have our next question here, also for Dr. Mendez. Can you provide us with the study you referenced on your PM 2.5 slide? They're asking, is it the invisible victims of disaster, understanding the vulnerability of undocumented Latino and Indigenous immigrants? So I think, yes.
Oh, I think I don't know if I was on mute. It's the Aguilera piece, and I can send it to the group via email. Aguilera in 2021, and I think it might have been the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences, but I can send it to Emily shortly.
Thank you very much. Yes, we can definitely share resources after this meeting. I had a question for Brittany. You had a slide up that showed, like the different communities impacted by wildfire. And maybe this is a question for Kaylee too, but understanding the size or scope of the problem, like how many vulnerable communities overlap with this high fire risk areas. If we know that number, or maybe that's something that we need to identify.
I'll let Kaylee add in here based on her research, but we actually, when we were looking at that slide, we were asking the same thing. And I mean, I think just from an experience standpoint, there are a lot in the Sierra Cascade region that kind of have carry that same profile of, one way in and one way out, and communities that are mostly made up of elderly people or people on a fixed income, or our tribal communities too are often in a position where the risk is the same as it would be for a community like Auburn or like Chico or others, but the ability for those communities to be able to actually do something about it is compromised.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in, when we did the vulnerability assessment, we did find as much, quantitative data as we could on the vulnerable populations in the Sierra region. So there's like 880,000 people, and we place numbers on what amount of the population belongs to each of the vulnerable communities that we identified. But there is, in general, I think like what Dr. Mendez said too, like huge gaps in existing data. So it's really hard. Like for the Sierra, there's no great data source for identifying who lives on a single access road. Like that data doesn't exist. It's not census data. So thinking of things in that way too, like there are huge gaps that if we did want to do a really good job at coming up with mitigation strategies, we would have to know those values and have really strong quantitative data. The qualitative data in the rural areas is really strong. We have a lot of stories and we can tell that story really well, but it is hard to request funding for an unknown amount of people.
Thank you. I see we have a hand raised from our director.
Yeah, so I think this was a really important point you just brought up, Kaylee, in terms of the data. And I was wondering, in all three of your presentations, there were some really important metrics that you guys were referring to. it would be helpful, and this can be sort of done offline, if you will, but if we could maybe know what are the authoritative sources or data sets that you have found around the communities, and assessments of and quantification of vulnerability, if you will, because that's really one of the things that I think this whole effort is trying to get at. Again, if we sort of center it back to risk modeling, right? I mean, the wildfire mitigation plans start with the utilities assessing where their risk is through that model. And so it's all about the inputs that go into that model. And as we're pushing the utilities to continue maturing that model and the sort of the way they model, it starts with what are the authoritative sources of data. Clearly, there's going to be gaps, as you already mentioned. So you identifying what those gaps are so that we can then drive development of those data sources. But of the existing ones, would really appreciate any sort of just list of what sources you have. And if you have a few that you can maybe name here to sort of address for the group, that would be great. But even as a follow-up, it would be helpful to know what those were.
I would say, you know, and that goes for your department as well as the California Natural Resources Agency, as they develop some of these statewide tools that they become ground truth. If everyone, you know, from the federal government and across the country is looking to the California Environmental Health Screen tool, Cal Enviro Screen, which just celebrated its 10-year anniversary, I believe, last week or 2 weeks ago, as sort of been the best in science we have in terms of equity and environmental justice and environmental health metrics. And that was really pushed through advocates, community-based organizations, teaming up with university partners like Manuel Pastor at USC, Rachel Morello-Foch at UC Berkeley, and James Sad at Occidental, I believe, and field testing it to provide the right indicators and finding out where communities are becoming invisible and where those hazards themselves are becoming invisible. So I would recommend that. I know my two colleagues here probably have a little bit more information on their data sets that they can point to, but I believe that Cal Enviro Screen method of engaging communities in ground truthing and field testing was quite important.
Thank you. I think data is going to be one of the big questions that we explore today, what we have available to model and what we might hope towards the future to have. We have our next question here from Joseph Mitchell. As the California utilities greatly expand their wildfire mitigation efforts, some of which are very expensive, such as undergrounding, utility rates have risen substantially. How do these rates impact vulnerable communities, and what is the best manner to balance safety and affordability?
I can give from the perspective we had on this from the vulnerability assessment. Sierra Business Council also runs the Sierra Nevada Energy Network, which is the local government partnership with PG&E that serves 14 counties in the Sierra region. So pretty familiar with how PG&E operates in the region. But there is a census metric of energy burdened populations. I believe it's you pay 10% of your income on utility bills. So there is some data for that. You know, census data isn't perfect, obviously, but that is sort of the measurement of 10% means you're energy burdened. And as rates go up, I think what we found in our research for the vulnerability assessment is people are less likely to personally adapt. So they're less likely to purchase, or if they do purchase, use their air conditioning or use air filtration systems. So there ends up being, you know, this increased impact that's purely financial. And I think the utilities would probably also be a good source of this data. You know, they'd know how many people are requesting, you know, discounts or qualify, you know, based on their income levels for a bill payment assistance. And also like how many bills aren't being paid or how many people are having their utilities shut off would be another metric that could be used. I don't know that the answer of how to best balance safety and affordability. I think that might be more of a corporate solution, but the data on it does show that there is in like limits, like cost to utilities is a barrier to just personally adapting to these hazards.
Thank you, Kaylee. I think that's really important to bring up, and it's an important question as well. You know, I think outside of the scope of our meeting here today, but something definitely to keep in mind. All right, we're running up on time for our Q&A portion, but I see we have a few more questions, so we'll take those and then we'll move on to our next section. This next question here, to what extent have each of your organizations been able to work with and learn from organizations in perhaps the South to seek support vulnerable communities from the dangers of hurricanes? To the extent that there are similarities, what have been those lessons learned? So learning from other natural disasters and what can we apply here for wildfire?
In terms of hurricanes, I think they're aware or extreme weather events. If we look at Texas in terms of the deep freeze that happened, was it last year or 2 years ago now? They are learning, and that's why the last slide that I presented was on the digital divide and how that's been further exacerbated through climate-induced disasters. And really disconnecting from people, from individuals and safety and disaster aid and resources. So we saw that happening in Puerto Rico, where still some communities are without broadband, internet, and other cellular services, or is still spotty. Some people didn't have any service or electricity for almost a year. And we also saw that in Texas. What were the communities first and hardest hit during that deep freeze of that extreme storm event? And it was low-income communities of color, African-American, and primarily Latino communities. Again, these are still the very same communities that have existing environmental injustice, environmental hazards, and crumbling infrastructure, historic disinvestment. So I think from Hurricane Katrina through Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico to those extreme snow events, it's really just showing over and over how climate-induced disasters are exacerbating existing inequalities and communities that traditionally have not been part of a traditional environmental movement or climate change movement are more and more embracing the framework of climate inequality, climate disproportionate impacts from climate-induced disasters, from migrant rights organizations to other social justice organizations are now expanding their platform to have a climate justice connection.
Dr. Mendez. And our last question here, someone is asking, doesn't SB 884 signed by the governor last year provide funding for undergrounding? And says this funding is not targeted to any group of population.
Emily, perhaps I'll jump in and answer that one. So I think what we're talking about today is about community vulnerability and how to take that into account when the utilities are specifically looking at their wildfire mitigation planning, and that includes their risk modelling. Now, the outputs of a utility's risk modelling will inform where they will be undergrounding. And so if you're including community vulnerability in the risk assessment, it should therefore get taken into consideration in terms of what particular projects are selected for undergrounding. So I think there's there was nothing in the specific legislation about that, but it's the process by which you identify those sites.
And oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Please go ahead.
Just one last comment. We just got a new research article accepted on Senate Bill 1000, which is requiring local governments and state agencies as well to have an environmental justice element in their general land use planning. And so I guess just because a bill is passed doesn't mean it's going to be equitably implemented. It takes follow-up, it takes oversight, understanding compliance. So in our analysis of SB 1000 compliance of how the city and county governments are implementing environmental justice into their general land use. It's quite lacking, and oftentimes it's not really pushed forward. It's a very a perfunctory sort of analysis and check the box list. And most importantly, related to our discussion here, those environmental justice elements of these general land use plans are not integrated or interconnected with their climate action plans, let alone their disaster and hazard mitigation. So it's going to take more oversight, more these type of analysis, and community groups in particular really highlighting the need to integrate our different forms of infrastructure planning, in this case, with disaster and climate as well.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think we've addressed all questions for this portion, which is wonderful. So we're going to move on. We actually have a poll for our audience. I think it's always important to ask who's in the room, and also be thinking about who might not be here today, but should be, perhaps to include them for next meeting. So while this poll is up, we can also use this as a quick opportunity to take a break if you need to refresh your coffee, take a stretch. I'll give it until 11:10, so just 3 minutes for everyone to get their answers in. And I also wanted to say thank you to our panelists for your thoughtful answers, and thank you too for members of the audience for your engagement in asking these questions. I think a big goal for today is to start having these kinds of collaborative discussions and begin problem solving together. All right, everyone, we are back from break. Thank you for getting your answers in. I'm going to share the results here, and I'm happy to see a good mix of people in the audience. We really appreciate you coming and contributing to today's discussion. All right. So next on our agenda, we have our program manager, Lucy Morgans, will be presenting Energy Safety's suggested approach for beginning to integrate community vulnerability. I'll hand the mic over to Lucy.
Thanks very much, Emily, and thanks very much to the panelists and the participants who are asking some really, really insightful questions. I think we've already learned a lot. So if you just turn to the next slide. So I think, is there a slide before this, Emily, which talks about the problem statement? Otherwise, I can just talk about it. Oh, yeah, there we are.
Oh, sorry, it got skipped ahead there. Go ahead.
No problem. Okay, so we've heard from the panelists today about the critical importance of taking community vulnerability into account in wildfire mitigation planning. And I would like to take the opportunity to talk about this more from energy safety's perspective. And so here we have the problem statement that really came out of our review of the 2022 utility wildfire mitigation plans. So the key issue that we identified, or the problem statement, is that the consequence or impacts of a wildfire are not felt equally across different communities. Socially vulnerable communities can be disproportionately impacted by wildfires and may therefore experience longer and more challenging paths to recovery. Right now, this is an issue that is not fully nor consistently taken into consideration by the utilities, and we'll hear more about the progress that they've made and the challenges they're facing later on in this meeting. We've got a presentation from Edison. So in terms of the objectives for today, firstly, we wanted to explore the importance of integrating community vulnerability into utility wildfire mitigation planning. And I feel like the panelists' presentations and discussions that we've already had have really helped drive forward this conversation. Secondly, we want to reach a common understanding of what community vulnerability means in the context of utility wildfire mitigation planning. So, for example, what are the key factors to consider? And this is what this part of the meeting will be focusing on. And you heard Caroline earlier identify, what are the data inputs? What's the data that the utilities will be taking into account when they're undertaking their risk modelling? And so we're really trying to focus in on that particular question. Thirdly, we want to collaborate on exploring a technical approach, or in other words, how to integrate community vulnerability into utility wildfire mitigation planning. We'll hear more about what Southern California Edison have done later on in this meeting, and we can talk about wildfire risk consequence modelling, but whether there's anything else, we really want to explore that question, what are the opportunities? And then finally, we've touched on both of these points, which is firstly, how best to learn from each other, including external agencies and outside experts, in terms of how we tackle this really important question. And then lastly, this scoping meeting is the beginning of a conversation. And so we really want to identify future topics to explore in relation to community vulnerability and how to integrate that into utility wildfire mitigation planning. And so that's something that we'll be capturing right at the end of this meeting. So just turning to the next slide. So in terms of data inputs, the team has done some research into what tools and data is available to measure community vulnerability. And I know that Kaylee and Brittany were talking about this. And there are a number of different tools. So for example, we've looked at the Healthy Places Index. This is a project of the Public Health Alliance of Southern California. It's a data and policy platform to support efforts to prioritise equitable investments and develop programmes and policies across the state. And it maps social conditions that drive health, that includes health, education, job opportunities, clean air and water. And some of those data points will be extremely relevant to what we'll be trying to capture as part of measuring community vulnerability. There's also the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, and we found this index particularly relevant to the work that we're doing. So this summarises the extent to which a community is socially vulnerable to disaster, and the data can be broken out into 4 key themes: socioeconomic status, minority status, household composition, and housing and transportation. And you'll see that our next poll includes many of the factors that the SVI, the social vulnerability, includes, although we have added some more to capture specifically the wildfire element. You've also got the FEMA National Risk Index for natural hazards, and that integrates the data from the SVI at a national level. And then lastly, you've got Cal EnviroScreen. And this is a mapping tool to identify communities that are most affected by sources of pollution, and it's particularly suited to urban communities, so probably less relevant to the communities that we're concerned with. And I think, you know, the conclusion that we came to from looking at all of these indices is that there's some really good work that we can take from. We can take some key data points from all of these indices, but there's no sort of one size fits all solution, and that each tool has its strengths and weaknesses. And the most critical thing is to have a shared understanding of what community vulnerability means in the context of utility wildfire mitigation planning, and that really is our starting point. So in terms of energy safety's proposed approach, our priority really is the focus on the community ability to recover from a wildfire. And we'll move on in a minute to the discussion where we'll really want to hear from the participants as to whether, you know, what are the benefits of this approach and what are the challenges, and is there anything else we should be considering? So this leads us to our next live poll, which is what do you think the factors are for measuring vulnerability in wildfire mitigation planning? We've listed a number of factors here, and we'd like you to select your top 3 if you're able to. As I mentioned, a lot of these factors are taken from the Social Vulnerability Index, although we have added factors like, for example, we have added the lack of evacuation routes and access, and also underinsured homeowners is another factor that we added in.
Thank you, Lucy. And I'll just add that this is a writing question. So if there's something not listed here that you think is important, you can include that in your answer as well. And we'll just give this a couple minutes as everyone thinks over their answer and shares those with us.
So the purpose of this is to identify what data points we need to include or ensure that are included as part of the utilities' efforts to capture community vulnerability when they're undertaking risk modelling exercises.
Exactly. And asking to select the top 3, it helps us just to know where to focus first, or what the group thinks might be the most important, although of course all of the factors are important.
And Emily, I see we've got some comments about Cal EnviroScreen that I will read out whilst folks are completing their live poll. So Cal EnviroScreen went from an internal agency tool to inform decision-making to a highly politicised metric that became the deciding factor. Cal EnviroScreen historically excluded wildfire-prone communities from receiving investment over the last decade in favour of discrete zip codes and urban communities. Creating a community vulnerability scoring metric may be similarly irresponsible as a deciding factor in decision-making rather than if used as a guideline or a tool. Thank you for that comment. We'll certainly take that into consideration. I think it raises some good points. And yes, this is the purpose of this is as a tool a tool for decision making rather than a deciding factor. It looks like we've had some participants completing the live poll, but if anyone else would like to complete it, I think we should just maybe have a minute or two to finish up here.
And again, we really do appreciate your feedback. We will definitely be considering it after the meeting. And also, I think it really helps inform the roundtable that's to follow this as we dig into thinking about how do we define community vulnerability in our context and what factors are most important to look at first. All right. I think we've got a good number of answers in. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And again, thank you for everyone who, for sharing your thoughts on this. I'm going to go ahead and move us next to the roundtable discussion. Again, just as a reminder, if you wish to participate, you can raise your hand or you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom. For those calling in, press 2 to raise your hand.
So for this roundtable discussion, I've sort of jotted down 4 key questions that I'd like folks to consider. So firstly, should energy safety be prioritising a community's ability to recover? Is there anything at any other dimension that you think is important for us to consider? How can we measure a community's ability to recover from a wildfire, and what are the challenges associated with this? Thirdly, is the data readily available? What are the hardest data sources to obtain, and how can we work around this? And then lastly, how well are the utilities doing this right now, and what are their plans to improve?
Thank you, Lucy. I think those are all really good questions to ask. I'll just also drop a reminder for our roundtable etiquette to please stay on topic, respect each other's different thoughts and opinions, and to remain open to new ideas. In addition to those thoughts shared by Lucy, we did share out 2 guiding questions to also help us and start our thinking for this portion of the event.
Maybe if we don't have any immediate questions, then it'd be helpful to turn to the large utilities and ask them what their views are on these questions. I don't know if we got anyone from PG&E on the line.
Perhaps we can circle back to PG&E if they just need to take a moment. But I see we have Brian Landry here from SCE.
Hey, Emily, thanks for that tee up. So community vulnerability, we'll talk about it a little more in our in the presentation I have, but I just want to differentiate community vulnerability from social vulnerability a little bit. And the way you have to think about this is, you know, communities are a living sort of organism. They evolve over time, just as the electric grid evolves over time, right? This is a 150-year-old system. And the communities that may have been vulnerable at certain points of time may no longer be vulnerable, or their vulnerability has evolved over time, or they may express different vulnerabilities. So if you think about this, you could have a small up and coming community, in downtown LA. That could have been the case, very ritzy 100 years ago, and it may be disadvantaged today. And it's the same electric grid that's serving them. So I want people to consider that the lens of community vulnerability has to be taken into account, not only the sort of social setting that you see today, but how it's evolved over time. And I think some of the speakers sort of presented that over, this morning, which I really appreciate that. When we think about community vulnerability in terms of wildfire specifically, then we have to think about how is that vulnerability expressing itself now? How has it expressed itself in the past? And how is it expressing itself in the future, or likely to express itself in the future? And I noticed a number of speakers talk about climate change and talk about vulnerability. So the way we've kind of approached this is we have modeled and non-modeled factors. And I'm going to get away from CDC and SOVI for a little bit. The way we think about this one is, basically, and I think that some of the speakers got to it earlier on today, is this community vulnerable to wildfire? Is it vulnerable to a wildfire of a certain size? Is it immediately vulnerable to wildfire? Meaning that, is it in the middle of a forested area with lack of ingress and egress? And then once we understand those things, then we can start layering all the social vulnerability factors. So the way we kind of approach this is sort of a layered and tiered approach. We try not to make a trade-off between if-then sort of factors, right? So it's hard to make a trade-off between some of the factors in your poll. For instance, do we make a trade-off between an area with an older population versus an area that's poorer? Or how do we compare that to an area that's older but richer versus younger and poorer? It's hard to make those trade-offs. So this is not an easy topic to consider. So the way we've kind of approached this with those things in mind, and I'd like to hear from the other speakers as well, is how do we sort of layer on these things in a way that's probably more humanistic and more qualitative than rather mathematical in the way we've been sort of, forced to sort of approach this. So that's sort of the topic that I'd like to hear from the perspectives from others on this call today. And again, thank you guys for having this forum. I think this is a really good sort of group of stakeholders to get multiple perspectives. So I really appreciate you guys setting this up.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, those are a lot of, I think, really important considerations. So thank you for bringing them up. And we are interested in hearing from, everyone on the call, of course, but also from the utilities to share their perspectives and how they've been thinking about this issue, or where they might want to integrate this in their planning in the future. I'd like to ask, is there anyone from SDG&E on the line who would like to share their thoughts?
Yeah, hi everyone, Joaquin Sebastian from SDG&E. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we follow a similar approach that Brian presented, right? We work with Technosilva to identify our areas with highest wildfire risk, and then we try to understand the communities that they are affected there. We are starting to identify our diversity and vulnerable communities, and then the challenge that we have, and I think Kaylee mentioned that, is that the scoring method, right? We can create a scoring method, but then we need to work with our frameworks, with our MAPA framework. And that's a little bit of a challenge for us. The way we are thinking about it is introducing these characteristics into our safety index, into the MAPA framework. And it can get complicated really quickly, because then there is a lot of overlap and a lot of multiple interactions between the factors, right? You have a disadvantaged community from the socioeconomic point of view, but it's also affected by climate change, right? And then it's also affected by a lack of egress, right? And I would say right now, I think Caroline mentioned about the data. Data is key for us, and it's not clear for us what are the right, or what is the source of truth in a lot of these. So I would appreciate some direction from OEIS about what is the right source of truth and how we need to quantify. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for those comments. I think part of the reason why I wanted to have the scoping meeting is just to explore those issues and how we can move forward with creating a consistent quantitative method for how do we measure these things and how do we make sure it's included in decision making. So definitely important factors all to think about.
So Emily, I'd like to just tee up something that Joaquin just brought up too. When we're thinking about, I know this scoping meeting is about wildfire, but we also have to consider that that we're optimizing for other risks that are out there. We're not just planning the grid solely for wildfire. We're also planning for PSPS. We're planning for climate. We're planning for projected load increases. We're projected for public safety. We have certain mitigations that are really good at. They have other co-benefits like reducing vegetation or, reducing inspection costs or public safety impact. So it's important to keep in mind, and sort of going to your second question, is that we have to also consider the co-benefits or the co-factors in buying down other sort of risks over time. And, I think we haven't presented our climate. We filed our CAVA, that's one thing, but we have a more granular sort of climate model that I'm just dying to share with you guys. And it'll show that, there are different co-benefits that may manifest itself in different communities in different ways. So those are other decision-making factors. It's hard to sort of hook everything on to sort of a quantitative analysis without taking to those factors into consideration. So again, I think that's why we're advocating more for a layering approach rather than an if-then approach, if that makes sense.
It does. And I'm glad you brought up other factors and co-benefits. I know we're focusing today on ability to recover from wildfire and thinking about community vulnerability in that context, but PSPS is also definitely important to consider. And also thank you for bringing up your climate model. I think we're going to have another scoping meeting to delve into climate change and that large complex topic on a separate meeting. So we'll look forward to it then.
Yep.
All right. I'll ask again if there's anyone from PG&E on the call who would like to share their thoughts. Well, we can always move back to them. I would like a chance to hear from our smaller utilities on the call as well. I think we have folks from Bear Valley, from Liberty, from Pacific Core. Perhaps we could start with Bear Valley if there's anyone on the call who would like to share.
Sure. Paul Marconi, President of Bear Valley. These are interesting topics and definitely topics for us to consider. I think this area would require a little bit of assistance because we're not necessarily experts on wildfire recovery. Those are things that other agencies and organizations are involved in. We're more interested in preventing wildfires and taking action there. Maybe a working group similar to what we did with AFN, where the utilities aren't necessarily experts on the AFN populations. So we brought in people and got us up to speed and helped us then tailor our actions to understand, meet their needs and understand better the issues. So I think this group is a good starting point. But that's where I would focus so that then we can make more informed decisions in our planning. But I think we're not necessarily the experts in deciding the ability of a community to recover. Discussed there. So that'd be my piece.
Thank you, Paul. No, and understanding the experience and differences in service territory that we all bring to this. It's important to hear these different perspectives. So thank you for sharing that. Do we have anyone from Liberty on the call?
Hi, this is Lee Kilbasa from Liberty. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, I work as emergency manager for Liberty and have some input into the wildfire management plan. Appreciate the presentations today. I mean, a lot of it is reflected in our wildfire management plan, but this gives us some really good background, regarding why you're asking, for the information that you are asking. So from that standpoint, we appreciate it. Liberty serves seven counties in Northern California. Most of our area is in tier 2 and tier 3 high wildfire threat areas. So this applies very much to us. We have a manager who deals with strictly, vulnerable populations and addresses, the vulnerability planning part of it. So while, we're already making decisions about, hardening and, different things, this, I think really helps too.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Is there anyone from Pacificor on the line? All right, hearing none. And sorry if you're having technical difficulties, we will have another chance to discuss these issues in our part 2 of the roundtable.
Emily, I think that PG&E might be having some technical issues
Okay.
talking, so I'm not sure if our IT folks might be able to reach out to Wade. Maybe to unmute him. Wade Greenacres, to unmute him.
Sure, give me 1 second. And this is Kevin Benson from Pacificor. I think I was able to get myself off mute. Just wanted to see if you can hear me now.
I can hear you now. Great.
Yeah, I would say generally in agreement with the comments presented by the other utilities. Maybe just pointing out, or I guess addressing a couple items specifically that were of interest. The importance, I think, of agreeing as much as possible to a common source of truth or kind of a system of record for data that would be used to assess the vulnerability, and then how that would be brought into utility wildfire risk models, and how that would be integrated into the OEIS technical guidelines for wildfire risk modeling. That was a good point. And then as a kind of a second point related to that, also looking at how some of the commonly used tools or technologies being employed by the various utilities can accommodate this type of risk modeling into their overall wildfire risk modeling. See if we can leverage some of the existing capabilities that have already been built out. And so I think exploring what's currently being done with some of the commercially available software is also probably a worthwhile effort for this.
Yes, definitely. For those who may know of helpful resources or tools already out there that they can share, we can definitely leverage that in thinking about what we want to do for our approach or how that could help inform. Thank you.
Emily, we have one question from Julian Ennis, which says, will a recording of this workshop be made available? Yes, it will be, and it will be uploaded to our events website and on the energy safety site.
I'll just briefly check in with PG&E if they're able to give their comments. I apologize, even having technical difficulties. Sometimes that just happens with these virtual meetings, but if you're able to, please go ahead. Well, no worries. I will be able to circle back to you during our second roundtable discussion. But with that, I think we'll move on. We just want to make sure we have time for the rest of our agenda.
Emily,
and-
we do have one attendee with their hand up.
Oh, we do. Okay. Yes. Let's go over to that attendee. Thank you so much for raising your hand, and we'll go ahead and unmute you.
Hi, Lee, I think you're unmuted now. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Elijah, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
All right. Well, that's all right. We do have another opportunity for folks to provide their comments in the second roundtable if there's a bit of a technical difficulty there as well. But thank you for raising your hand, and please feel free to raise it again in the next portion. But in the meantime, sorry, I want to move us forward in our agenda. We do have a presentation from SCE sharing how it has begun to incorporate social vulnerability into its consequence modeling. And if questions come to mind as we hear from the presenter, Brian Landry, please hold them to the end of the presentation, or if you'd like, you can use the Q&A function in Zoom to jot them down. And with that, I'll hand it over to Brian.
Hey, thanks, Emily. Let me present my screen. Just give me 1 second to see if I can get it started. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen, but we are able to see your presentation notes and next slide.
Okay. What about now?
We are still just seeing the presentation notes and next slide. If you click on the option for, there should be 3 dots down below the presentation slide. If you click on that, there should be a hide presenter view option that'll just kick it straight to the main slide that we're looking at there.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not doing it. Maybe because I'm in the Zoom. But let me just try this, and hopefully we'll get through it, and you guys get a preview for the next slide. So thanks everyone for allowing me to present today. It's a really important topic. I'm super happy to present. This is just want to be mindful. This is one perspective. This is Edison's perspective. The other utilities have very similar approaches. And when I started developing this, what I wanted to get across is that there are many different ways to view this topic. And as we talked about this morning, there are pros and cons of some of the data sources that are out there. They're very good data sources, but they have a certain perspective and they have a certain sort of viewpoint, and they have a certain use case. And I think some of the comments we've made this morning, or we've heard this morning, they may be, may have pointed that out. So we at Edison try to prioritize where we deploy mitigations at the highest public safety risk. That is not just for wildfire, that's for all different public safety risks that we face. But we do have a specific social and community vulnerability assessment that we use in our prioritization for wildfire. One is for social vulnerability, we have something called an access and functional needs multiplier. And then for community vulnerability, we've identified communities of elevated fire concern. We also, in preparing for wildfire and also preparing for PSPS events, we make sure that we work with our customers, including local and tribal agencies, fire agencies, CBOs, other utilities for emergency planning, management, and outreach. We try to focus on those communities that are most vulnerable to wildfire and those communities that are most vulnerable to PSPS. We have much more information that I'm able to share with you today, and those of you that know me, that I could speak for hours on this topic, but I'd really like you guys to look at, either ask questions after this panel or go to our WMP filing, and it has a lot more additional information. Okay, so with that, what I will show out is these are just 2 data sources. I think we've talked about them this morning. This is just a view of Edison's territory. There are some pros and cons to some of this data, and this is just a starting point for discussion. So the social vulnerability, I think the best one that I've found that's probably more appropriate, and this is actually used by the FEMA National Risk Index. It's a social vulnerability index, and it's very well thought out. It has a lot of different dimensions across them. It's got age-based dimensions. It's got socioeconomic status. It's got gender. It's got English as second language. It's got a whole bunch of different metrics, and you can actually use some of these metrics to tailor certain programs to certain communities in different ways. And we could talk about how programs can impact different communities in different ways and be tailored that way. The con, and this is the con with a lot of geographic data, is presented in geographic and political boundaries. You got census tracts, you have counties, and they don't particularly represent rural areas very well, which, if you know wildfire, it's mostly in rural areas. So in this particular screenshot, you can see on the lower left-hand side, you can see the whole Angeles National Forest. This is one big giant census tract, but it would be unfair to say that people along the Angeles crest at the bottom of that, Angeles Forest up here has the same social vulnerability as the high desert. So one specific disadvantage, as you can see by using this geography, is that it doesn't allow us to sort of normalize across these areas. Another disadvantage for social vulnerability, and I think I kind of alluded to it earlier, it doesn't allow you to normalize across different sort of socioeconomic and vulnerability metrics, for instance. You could have areas that are very wealthy, that have a very low vulnerability in terms of social economic vulnerability, but could have a lot of vulnerability in terms of other risk factors. You could have a lot of older populations in those areas. And despite their wealth and status, that you can say, they would still have a problem and challenge getting out of those communities, right? So it's hard to sort of balance out those metrics. So there's a challenge with using some of these and normalizing a lot of different metrics across these. Another metric that we've looked at too for community vulnerability, and this is just an example to start the discussion, is we've looked at CAL FIRE has an AB 2911 map, or a CAL FIRE communities at risk map. So this is a communities at risk map that you can see here at the bottom right. So again, it's a good statewide metric. It considers vegetation, historical fires, WUI, ember spread, all the stuff you think you would want in wildfire sort of community vulnerability map, right? The challenge with it, as you can see here in the pale salmon color, is that it includes areas where you think, hey, how did this happen? Like this whole city of Los Angeles, the whole city of Ontario, you have the whole city of Long Beach, which are generally not what you would think of as the most sort of at-risk vulnerable communities for wildfire, or only maybe just a portion of these communities are at risk for wildfire. So this is an example where you have population-based boundaries, which, though it's a standard metric, may prove sort of misleading if you would use it prima facie. So I'll go to the next slide. I know you guys have a preview. So this is just a click down of our AFN, the way we have our AFN metric. So we thought that SVI was not very appropriate to use for a number of different reasons, where I just mentioned it before. Not that it's a bad metric, it's just that, we just don't think it's, adequately reflects the granularity and the way we operate the grid, right? Another reason is we started exploring this in Q4 of 2022. We had a pilot where we actually surveyed 76,000 customers in our most frequently impacted circuits for PSPS. And we actually got about a 19% response rate. In the future, we plan to actually survey all of our AFN combustors. I think it's 1.2 million accounts to make sure that we, one, adequately address, hey, do we know where our AFN population is? And I'll get into the definition of AFN in a second. And two, do we understand the relative what types of services and needs that these populations have? We're going to get into some economic sort of surveys that are going to happen later on next year, which I can talk about more. So we're slowly advancing our ability to understand these communities and sort of move the process forward and serve them. But what we mean by AFN customers, and this is from the PSPS order instituting investigation that happened, I think, post 2019. AFN customers are basically ones that meet one of the following criteria. They're critical care customers. They're a medical baseline customer, which is sort of, they have to have special needs and access to round the clock sort of power to power medical devices, low income customers, customers with limited English, customers that are pregnant or have children. So this is an amalgamation of these populations. If you look at this map really closely, and this is generally from Long Beach out to the Inland Empire, you can see it gives a pretty good dispersion. The darker areas represent where we have circuits that are relatively more disadvantaged than the communities that are lighter in color. And you can see a good trend that happens here. The trend is the more urbanized areas in our service territory. There are some exceptions around the Cajon Pass, are generally more disadvantaged. The areas that are in the wildland areas are more socially advantaged, I guess you could say. So you can start seeing a population sort of pattern emerging here. But what this does is this is allow us to focus in terms of cost effectiveness on when we assess cost effectiveness for mitigations, and focus on the prioritizing those mitigations deployed to those locations specific to those circuits in these relatively disadvantaged communities. Now, this is not a perfect metric. This is just something that we thought was one click down that was a little bit better, and that was a little easier for us to assess vulnerability specific to our circuits. One other thing, and it's like I'm bashing political geographies all day, but one other problem with political geographies is our circuits meander through a lot of them. And in order to properly assess the weighting of these circuits, we would have to take a weighted average across these geographies, and those could have sort of, for lack of a better word, gerrymandering results. So we wanted to avoid that as well. So we think going specific to the circuits themselves was probably the most appropriate. So we can come back to this, but I wanted to go to how we assess community vulnerability, and then we can come back. So another approach that we took, and this is separate from the AFN approach, and this is separate from our egress approach, which hopefully will be another topic of discussion in another workshop, is we actually looked at specific communities. You can see a lot of communities. Again, this is the same geography. This is basically Long Beach out to the west area of our service territory. You can see a lot of communities in the Angeles Forest. You can see in the San Bernardino National Forest, also in the Cleveland Forest down here. You can see that there are a lot of communities that we've said, hey, even small discrete fires that happen under benign conditions, not the worst case conditions, can immediately impact communities that are uphill. This is an example in this screenshot of Diamond Bar, right? So Diamond Bar, you would think, oh, I wouldn't think that's a socially or community of vulnerable risk to wildfire. But if you know about wildfire risk modeling, you know that wildfire generally moves uphill, and it moves uphill really quickly because imagine it's like a candle turned on its side, and it really melts that wax really quickly. So you see all these little fingers with these houses that are perched on top. It's very scenic, but it's also very risky in terms of wildfire. And there's a lot of, their utility assets are generally built within these canyons or built over time along these locations. So this is a place called Tonner Canyon. I know it very well, where you can see that if a fire were to happen in this canyon, that it could immediately impact some of these communities very quickly, and maybe without even the community knowing it until it's upon them. So we wanted to make sure to identify these communities. Happy to go into it more. A number of ways we identified it, a lot of speed judgment. We worked for our emergency safety partners. We had fire science. We have risk management. We have looked at every part of our service territory many times over in terms of mitigation scoping, in terms of fire planning, and we've pressure tested this with a lot of individual communities. One thing I'll point out here, we've actually looked in adjacent service territory communities where we have assets. So you can see this place. This is south of La Cañada Flint Ridge. This is around the Pasadena area, north of Los Angeles, around the Verdugo Hills. Community of elevated fire concern. That's an area where we do have transmission assets. So we're not just looking at our specific communities themselves. We're looking at through a whole service territory. Happy to talk more about this a little more as we get later on, but that's generally the presentation that I have for you today, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Brian. I think it's really helpful to hear from one of the utilities and just getting an example of what's being currently done now, and also the thinking around the data and some of these opportunities and challenges as we move forward. If we have any questions, folks, please feel free to raise your hand to ask Brian, or again, you can use the Q&A feature.
It looks like we had a question from Dr. Michael Mendez about the risk maps that you showed, Brian. Are these maps approved by the CPUC or at your office? What oversight is there on investor-owned utilities in developing these risk maps and social vulnerability analyses? This might kind of lead to the CARVA. I think that's how you developed the maps, wasn't it, through the CPUC proceeding? Is that correct?
No, that's not. So the CAVA had a specific, I was involved in phase 1 and phase 2 of the CAVA. So there was a specific definition of the CAVA. So those are social and disadvantaged vulnerable communities, which is a combination of Cal and virus stream, which there are challenges. And also the top 25%, I believe, of the disadvantaged tracts based on a certain percentage. But again, you have that challenge with the census tracts they don't represent rural communities very well. So I would say that. But no, it's a great question. Going to the first question, this is part of our WMP filing. So we created these maps. And I know the other utilities have similar maps, but I think we've provided these in forms of data requests on our website. We can follow up if you'd like to get more info.
Thanks for that clarification.
But it's an important point because there are so many different ways to look at social vulnerability and community vulnerability that one of the challenges, how do you, do you need, and then if you do need, how do you determine a sort of map that sort of rules all maps, or do you develop maps for specific risks, right? So if I'm developing a flood risk map and I have it for a specific purpose, it's not going to probably have the same metrics, or maybe it does, for a wildfire maps, because they may manifest themselves at different locations. So it's a very important concept, and this is something that I'm very interested in how academia can give us ideas on this.
Thank you. And I think that's a really good segue into our next roundtable discussion. And folks, if you do have questions, please feel free to bring them up or continue to bring them up during the roundtable. For anyone who joined late, I just wanted to share this slide again for how to participate and also for our roundtable etiquette. These are two guiding questions for our part 2 of the discussion. And I think it really dovetails well with what Brian was talking about earlier about these different opportunities and challenges, but also to think about more widely to what other opportunities there might be to bring community vulnerability into decision making. So I would like to hear from the other utilities. Now that you've heard more about SCE's approach, if you could maybe share your thoughts, or how it maybe is like similar or different than you're thinking about this issue.
Hi, Emily. Joaquin here from SDG&E. Just a couple of thoughts. I think the opportunity is in reaching alignment, right? We hear about the intersection between multiple proceedings, that they have different definitions. And we also hear about the multiple data sets, right? So I would say that identifying the alignment, and it will be really beneficial, because as utilities, we spend a lot of time sometimes justifying or explaining our data sources and how we translate that into risk models. So I see that as a huge opportunity. Brian had a really good point in his presentation, right? The census tracts are political boundaries, they are really large, and we need to intersect that with our assets and with our customers. And that intersection sometimes is not easy, because we are at risk of double counting. So maybe having some guidance on what it will be academia, how academia can help us do those type of intersections, thinking also about downscaling climate risk models projections. I think it will be really important for us. And those are just some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other utility representatives on the line who would like to share their thoughts as well?
Yes.
This is Elijah Devon with PG&E. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Great. I was trying to jump in earlier. I'm with the enterprise risk team, and in particular, my focus is actually on the risk rulemaking. And in phase 2 of that decision, I wanted to note there was an approval of an environmental and social justice pilot study plan, which we'll be implementing and first up to release in our May 2024 ramp. Along with some opportunities for the decision for other stakeholders, such as the Commission's Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group, which we should be on the schedule, to my understanding, on June 16th, to provide input on how we are implementing the 7 action items in that risk rulemaking as kind of a first step into trying to identify how risks are impacting disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. It does in particular play into this first question that you are posing here in terms of community vulnerability to consequence modeling, with trying to set up a framework that consistently applies consequence impacts as well as the benefits of mitigations to disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. But do want to note this is very much a seemingly first step, and we are tying our criteria as per the rule into the CAVA criteria for disadvantaged vulnerable communities using Cal EnviroScreen. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how that plays out, noting that is at the census tract level. And many of our risks at this point are able to go more granular than that. And in particular, seeing the opening on this entire workshop has really brought a lot of notes to just how well we do actually know communities and social vulnerabilities, but trying to bring that into our decision making, I think, is still a step ahead. But we do really look forward to hearing more engagement on that in the DECAG, as well as other opportunities that I think we'll be releasing for public input into this environmental and social justice pilot study plan. I did also really want to note and say I appreciated Brian Landry's presentation, as well as many of his statements around the multiple layers and considerations that we have to, in again, not just wildfire, but all risks and consequence modeling regarding things that we need to consider as different layers and steps to appropriately applying our mitigations through the risk framework. And actually, one last thing I did want to jump in on in that phase 2 decision as well. We've been instructed for those not as familiar with the risk rulemaking, we are to apply consequences using consider consequences related to safety, reliability, or financial. And in that rulemaking, we the utilities were required to use ICE 1.0 for this next stage of ramp filings, and as well as start to explore the ICE 2.0. ICE is the interruption cost estimate calculator provided by or developed by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs with a grant from the Department of Transportation. And in discussions with LBNL on the ICE 2.0 calculator development that we're currently in the early stages of, they have mentioned also there is the POET tool, which, pardon, but I do not remember exactly what that acronym stands for. However, the ICE 2.0 tool, to my understanding, sends out mailers requesting people to go to a website, and we do have some concerns, I think, that we have voiced about our ability, particularly to engage the vulnerable, considering that is not a very accessible method for getting a wide variety of inputs. Noting that the POET tool is supposed to help bridge that gap, which not only considers more, and again, I've only just briefly heard of this, but I do want to mention it here. This POET add-on to the ICE 2.0 more directly engages communities and is really targeting, I believe it is specifically the social vulnerabilities, in order for us to better identify the consequences of risk events related to social vulnerabilities, thanks to this POET tool. Noting that, again, a lot of this is all very early stages, but the more we can kind of get on the same page as to how to do all of these consequence modelings and what we can really expect from what our consequence modeling and then applying benefits for mitigations, the more we can get on the same page with these actions, I think the more kind of useful discussions we can have to continue the improvement to risk modeling, risk consequences throughout our systems.
Thank you for those comments. I think you bring up a lot of important points. It is important to note, other venues and other work streams that are happening around this topic with the CPUC, like you said. But also thank you for sharing those resources and tools. That is something that we're definitely looking at to see other resources we could possibly leverage about our own approach here, and also to think about continuing the conversation that we start here today. I think it would be helpful to be on the same page and have a consistent approach where possible. Thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Of course. Do we have any other utility representatives who would like to give a comment? Or a question? It's also okay if you would like to ask and answer questions of each other. I'll ask for our small utilities on the line. If you have any other thoughts or questions as you heard Brian's presentation or for this part of the discussion.
So Emily, I'll bring up one and this is more of a philosophical point, knowing that this is a sort of academic in nature topic. One of the challenges with any sort of trade-off analysis in general, and I think this may be applicable, is that you're always trading off between different viewpoints and different sort of attributes. And in order to do that, you could have attributes that could fit multiple classes of populations, right? So it's hard, and I think Joaquin brought this up a little bit and wanted to pull the thread some. It's hard to sort of make a trade-off between, like I said, the populations that are more likely to perish in fires and in hurricanes and either pre-hurricanes or over hurricanes, or the older populations, right? This is well studied. There's a lot of study in academia about this. And, it may or may not be appropriate to look at just specifically, if I were to pull out the slice from CDC, the older populations, right? But those older populations, and I think I alluded to this earlier, may not fully represent other attributes of vulnerability that I think are important to the community that we need to consider. So the older populations may not fully represent sort of the needs of younger populations, kids, mothers with children, single mothers with children, single parents with children. It may not fully represent people with medical needs, which may or may not be older. So I think one of the things that we have to consider as a group, as a stakeholder community, is that we want to make sure that we're very cautious not to make these trade-offs without fully fully understanding the type of vulnerability that we're trying to prevent. And I kind of like how you guys framed this up, that it may be one vulnerability for preparation and maybe another vulnerability for the ability to recover post-fire. And it may be other programs that you'd have to develop post-fire. The way that we've thought about this as utility is not necessarily post-fire. What we've tried to do is we've tried to deploy places or actually assess vulnerability where people would have the lack of the ability to adapt or escape a fire or not have the resources to prepare for it. So having that understanding about what you're exactly trying to prevent, I think is important, because in many respects, this is a very important topic. I'm not disparaging it at all, but it's very hard to grasp a topic like this because there are very broad definitions sometimes, and they may be different definitions in different ways. So I wanted to just put that out as sort of a talking point and maybe a discussion point while we have the stakeholder community out here.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think it is a large, complex topic to tackle because the community vulnerability definition can be quite broad. And we're trying to narrow it down to understand what does it mean in our context of our work here. And also we may not, of course, have all the answers here today. I think it's really the start of a conversation to try to get at that understanding, that shared understanding to move us forward.
Emily, let me just ask Brian a question. So in hearing you talk about, it feels to me like there's a fine balance in terms of having a clear definition of what we mean by community vulnerability, but perhaps the utilities having some flexibility in terms of how they interpret it. Do you think that a very strict, highly consistent definition is something that we should be headed towards, or do you think there should be some level of flexibility in terms of the utilities being able to interpret that in a way that makes sense for their service territory?
So seeing my presentation, I think having the flexibility to interpret it, but at least have a clear definition of what it is that we're solving for is useful, because at Edison we have very granular data, and it's more granular than the data that's out there, and it's more consistent with the way we operate the grid, so it's more useful to our sort of needs. But if I were to put, let's say, the CDC social vulnerability index next to our AFN multiplier index, it would look very consistent, the patterns. It just, I would want to avoid the artificial gerrymandering amongst circuits by having a strict definition, put it that way.
On the topic of data granularity, did you say, is it ideally circuit level that would be meshing well with your tool, or what level?
So circuit level is good for Edison, and there's a number of reasons. I would ideally like to go to circuit segment level, like pole to pole, right? But this is just me being a data geek. But the problem is we don't operate the grid that way. And I wouldn't want to, for instance, underground one place and then pop up and overhead another place and go down, because one, that'd be probably more costly and operationally difficult. But the second is we also operate other safety risk mitigations in that way. So it's not like we can perform PSPS only on this section. It's when you turn off the power, you're turning it off to the whole circuit. And also it's useful to help deploy mitigations to a whole circuit, because generally that's one neighborhood, right? So when you're deploying one neighborhood, let's say backup batteries or medical devices, it prevents that discussion that I have with my neighbors, because I'm in a high fire risk area, that, hey, why does your power get shut off and mine didn't get shut off? And we're across the street. Or why did you get a backup battery and I'm not qualified? So it gives you some very weird socioeconomic conversations that you're going to have with your neighbors, and you're going to have with your utility company too. So it's important to understand those local communities that you serve, and our electrical topology doesn't follow these political boundaries in the way that the data is presented, which is hopefully what you gathered from the presentation that we saw today. Even for these mountain communities, right? It could be, we have adjacent utilities that are on the line right now with Bear Valley. We had a conversation with them last week on some other topics, but we'd want to make sure we have something consistent with them and a consistent view of wildfire risk with them. Even though our electrical topologies are kind of separated, but we're adjacent. We have the same conversations with San Diego. We have similar conversations at PG&E. So it's not like we're having these conversations in a vacuum based on the data that's available. We try to take a really, we don't sit in our ivory towers. We actually look at these specific areas to say, does this make sense for this particular area? Hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
It does help. And it seems from your presentation, because of the gap in data, having to have subject matter experts kind of review and make sure it makes sense for your service territory is kind of how you've navigated that.
I can take another approach and stab at it. So I'm from very rural southern Louisiana. So if you were to look at flood risk post-Katrina and you look at social vulnerability, the CDC map would have told you the same places where it actually manifests itself, right? So it shows you the poorer parts of Jefferson Parish. It shows you the poorer parts of Orleans Parish. It shows you Plaquemine Parish. These are places that are socially disadvantaged. The SVI map would have showed you that. But if I were a utility there, I would want to know the specific feeders in the specific circuits, right? So these data sources are very useful to show you the general pattern, but you want to have the flexibility to actually adjust to the actual operational constraints of your system itself. And that's just one example for flooding, right?
Thank you. That is helpful. I think also, well, always helpful to have like these other examples and what we can learn from other natural disasters to apply here too. Right.
I think we have one question here. Would you like me to read it out?
Yeah, please go ahead.
It says, are utilities embracing cultural burns as a key wildfire mitigation to deploy around vulnerable communities in order to reduce their vulnerability?
I'm not sure I understood the first couple of words. Community
I
burdens.
think it's about embracing cultural burns.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So there are different cultural barriers. It's one thing that I think we experience a lot in Edison's territory is there's a language population. There's a language barrier, right? We have, I think, over 100 different languages that people speak within our service territory. You know, and actually communicating with them and making sure that they understand that the information available to them is very challenging to us. And I think if you look at our website, we have specific requirements to make sure that we communicate with different populations in different ways. But that's one way we're trying to embrace the cultural differences, or at least the way that communication may be different across different population types within our service territory. Another interesting point too, if you think about this, and the most recent examples of like, and I'm going to go hurricanes again, because that's where just my mind went to. If you think about it, in this day and age, this is a little, in the last couple of hurricanes that happened around Houston and Southwest Louisiana were a little different than Katrina. And Katrina, cell phones were not that popular. You didn't have social media that you have today. So the communication mediums are very few and far between. I remember sitting in Baton Rouge and no one knew what was going on at all, regardless of the language barriers, right? So it was word of mouth in Louisiana, and people basically went door to door, and people went boat to boat to different places. In this last population, it was in this last couple of hurricanes, it was interesting because everything was social media based. And actually, what's interesting too is that the cell towers stayed up, so you could actually communicate. But there's certain parts in time where the cell towers don't even work. So how do you make sure you operate the grid and prioritize those communication assets to make sure that your mitigations are allowing people to communicate back and forth? So the other side of our AFN index multiplier is also a non-residential critical infrastructure multiplier, where we also try to prioritize those areas where we have critical infrastructure such as communication devices to make sure we're also prioritizing those locations as well. The challenge again becomes I'm mixing up two different types of vulnerabilities. So I'm watering down the prioritization of each one. So it gets really tricky at that point because keeping up cell towers allows people to communicate, but also keeping up cell towers may not be in the same locations where we have vulnerable populations. So we may be mixing and matching prioritization methods here, both for good reasons, but it's hard to make those trade-offs. And we really shouldn't at some point in time. That were two different examples of sort of community barriers to vulnerability. There are several others, several others.
And we did get a question about are the utilities embracing I think prescribed burns, fires, or indigenous practice to maintain the landscape as a potential method to protect vulnerable communities. And I think that what this question brings up too is that, today we're focused on, utility wildfire mitigation planning, but we are, of course, existing in a larger landscape of California for, wildfire mitigation overall as well and other practices.
Yeah, so I could speak for Edison at least. We work with the Forest Service. We work with federal government in our service territory. We understand their prescribed burn plans, our emergency managers work with them. We are sort of neutral. We don't have control over what they do. Anything that reduces risk to our assets, I think would be beneficial. That's one of the tools in the toolbox. And we coordinate with them as much as we can. If you look at our facilities, at least around Shaver Lake, we have some forests that we manage ourselves. And during the Creek Fire, we were actually commended that because we do thinning and because we have prescribed burns around those over many years. We really managed that forest well. When the creek fire came through it, it didn't impact our facilities. Well, it did impact our facilities, but it did not impact our forested lands, our managed forest lands, like it did the surrounding forest lands. I will say that.
Thank you. All right, and we're running a little close to time here, but I just want to give an opportunity for any of the other utilities if they have any comment on, either cultural barriers or, prescribed burning, and how they're, perhaps considering that as part of a, protection for vulnerable communities.
So, hi, Emily, Joaquin from SDGNE. Regarding the prescribed burns, the way we are doing is we work with Silva because they provide us the wildfire simulations, and they are responsible for updating the fuels layer. And I believe some of that is captured there. I don't know if Brian, that is really familiar with our work, can help me out here, but.
Yeah, so prescribed burns are generally not captured in the Technosilva map if they're smaller than 5,000 acres. And the problem with those prescribed burns is we don't know where they're going to happen. That's the problem. It's not something we can really count on when we do our simulations. And it's hard to project if they're going to happen out in the future. Generally, these prescribed burns are year on year. The Forest Service is given a bucket of money, and depending on fuel and fire conditions, they either burn a lot or they burn a little. There was a fire prescribed burn not too far from me, where I live, that went out of control not too long ago. So I can say sometimes they don't go as planned. I can tell you that for personal experience in the last month. So it's not something we can fully account for.
All right, thank you. Before we move on to next steps, are there any other questions or comments? Paul, if anyone would like to speak or raise a question.
We have one more question here that goes to something that's been mentioned before about planning for multiple hazards. So, for example, on the topic of flooding, what are the utilities doing to harden their system so that when the flooding comes, it does not disrupt service, particularly in the areas where wildfire has occurred?
Yeah, I could speak to our efforts that are going on right now. So we have a number of distribution assets in the high Sierras, the Big Creek system. We had the creek fire that went through a couple years ago. We have proactively looked at deployed sort of barriers to make sure that debris doesn't flow into those systems and damage those systems. And we've made sure that we do some preemptive dredging to make sure that the excessive flooding that's coming off the Sierras right now doesn't interrupt the generation that's going to happen over the summer that we're going to rely on, and we're going to rely on more in the future as our clean power pathways, rely on this hydro more and more for balancing our resources. So I think understanding climate risk, not just for distribution assets, but also generation assets that are in those areas are going to be really important. It's not necessarily just the downstream impacts to our customers, why those are really important. It's making sure that the system is resilient itself. I think there's more information in our CAVA on flooding high level, and you're going to see some more information that comes out in the GRC that's going to be filed at the end of this week. So I don't want to preempt that a little bit too much, but I think we can have a whole nother conversation on flooding and climate risk.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that is important to bring up. We will have, of course, more opportunities to continue discussion, I think, as a follow-up activity. But let me bring us now to next steps. I think it's time. So these questions are really carrying forward what we started here today to continue thinking about and developing a consistent approach. Also, we want to consider the long-term vision of what we want to work towards, what it might look like in 3 years or in 10 years as more data comes available. So not to limit ourselves and not to let the perfect become the enemy of the good, and thinking about our approach. As for a proposed follow-up activity, I think it would be helpful to hear from the utilities and see what they might agree on for a consistent approach to incorporating community vulnerability into wildfire consequence modeling. As part of that, of course, identifying key challenges, working assumptions, their timeline for implementation, and other outstanding questions. I realize we are at an early phase here and kind of tackling this large and complex issue, but I think it would be helpful to try to propose a straw man that energy safety can review and finalize and invite public comment on. Now we have our last and final poll of the day before we end. Please consider this our comment box and take a few moments to share your thoughts. Anything else that we didn't get to cover today that you think is important for energy safety to consider, thoughts on our next steps, maybe perhaps who wasn't in the room today that could be invited to a future meeting, other helpful resources, anything else you'd like us to consider. We do really appreciate and value your feedback. All right, so you should see that poll pop up there. And I think we are almost at time. So while you're considering and writing in your answers, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. And a big thank you to our wonderful panelists and presenters. We really appreciate you lending your expertise on this important topic. The energy safety team will be looking at all the notes taken today. And again, we greatly value everyone's input and collaboration. Please feel free to reach out to me with additional questions. Again, my name is Emily Ginsberg. These slides will be available on the Energy Safety website, and the recording will also be available on YouTube. So thank you, and everyone have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Emily.
For those still on, I'm going to leave the poll open for one more moment, 1 more minute. So please do get your answers in, and thank you. All right, thank you, everyone. We really do appreciate your participation. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Have a great rest of your day.